he is, Nat Taylor.
Thank you, Gene. Can we get the lights dimmed, please? It's kind of hard to see that presentation the way it is. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. Well, I'm glad I impressed somebody at the History Center. Yeah, it's former managing director. Unfortunately, they just recently closed up shop and put the exhibits into storage, intending to reopen it at the Franklin Grove. So the Morris History and Culture Center was a division of the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County. It's a long-standing historic preservation nonprofit. Opened it. Wonderful history center at the old 1905 county jail. You may recall Belmont University purchased the O'Moore College of Design school in Franklin, and as they've moved the school to Belmont's campus, they sold the property to the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County, and they intend to open a really neat facility there called Franklin Grove. They're kind of using Cheekwood as a model. They're going to have botanical gardens there. There's a main antebellum red brick mansion on that property. It's beautiful, and they're going to have an art museum in there. And there's another old residence on that property that the History Center will move into at some point. So that was the first managing director there, was there for 2 years. Had a great time. I was loath to part from that position, I'll say that. I am a historian for hire, but I do not do kids' parties. I just want to throw that out there right now. I will do adult parties, but not kid parties. Yeah. How's the microphone on that? You guys hear me okay? Yeah. Now, if you didn't get a chance to see the History Center, it really was very well done, and I'd encourage you to go back and visit it when it eventually reopens at some point in the future. I will have moved on to bigger and better things, hopefully. But loved my time there, and yeah, hopefully you get a chance to go visit it when it reopens. So I'm going to tell a story. I like to start with the story. So when we first opened, I was told by my marketing team that we wanted to do a front page story about the History Center in Berry Farm's local magazine. I was like, oh great, okay, maybe they'll have this nice picture of the front of the building on the cover, and did an interview with them. They took photos of the place. It was a good time. And then, about a week later, my marketing director gets a hold of me and goes, have you seen the magazine yet? And I said, no. And he said, you better go check it out. They put me at the front of it. Maybe they're the ones that called Eugene and said, you got to talk to this guy. I don't know. Evidently I impressed them. But it was a little embarrassing. But I tell this because storytellers to the front, that's one thing I love about history is we can parse out these personal stories. We think about history as these grand waves and these huge events, but we can get more granular and pull out these personal stories of people that lived it. I think it makes it more alive and more tangible and can help us really learn lessons of history. The Reconstruction era in particular, it's always been my wheels. I say always, in my adult life, it's fascinating to me. It was this very unique period in U.S. history where, if you think about the Civil War, civil society had broken down. I mean, the war was awful. Courts were not being heard. People's, grievances, there was no place to take them. There was vigilante justice and, bushwhackers going around terrorizing people. I mean, civil society had really broken down. And so in the wake of that war, when it ended, there was this golden opportunity to kind of remake society. And it's just fascinating thinking about the competing ideas that people had for what should the United States look like? Who should vote? How are they going to vote? Slavery's done. How do we rebuild the Southern economy that was based on that enslaved labor? Right? I mean, these are big questions, and just those competing ideas. Just and what we ended up with, unfortunately, was there were some wins, and it kind of was a missed opportunity in many ways too. But kind of the themes and stuff I want to talk to you today about is I'm going to give kind of an overview of Tennessee Reconstruction, kind of the first half, and then the second half. I think I failed to mention I was for 6 years an archivist at the Tennessee State Library and Archives before I was managing director of the History Center, and had an opportunity, a really unique opportunity to really dig into Record Group 60, the legislative records there, the General Assembly. And I was assigned the years right after the Civil War, as 1866 through 1870. That was my first assignment as an archivist there. And they were like, would you like to work on these records? And I was like, okay, but inside I was like, yes, 1,000 times yes. As a kid, I was about 9 years old when Ken Burns' Civil War documentary came out, and my parents were very taken with that, and I watched it with them too. And so that summer we were part of one of thousands of families that summer that went to Virginia and visited the battlefields and spent a week at the Smithsonian, going through all those museums. That was a very formative moment in my life. I was fascinated by the Civil War, but as I got older and decided to pursue history as kind of my academic and pursuit in my profession, like the Reconstruction era, really gravitated towards that. Like that war is terrible. I mean, I'm not a veteran. I don't even pretend to grasp how horrible war must be, but it's studying it as a historian, I think it helps you grasp it a little bit. But it's those social changes brought about by wars, especially like World War II. You think about the changes that it brought in U.S. society. Same thing with post-Civil War, but it was even more of a golden opportunity because the society in the United States had actually broken down. So what was it going to look like coming out of it? Nobody knew, but people had a lot of different ideas, and we're going to talk about those today. So first half, little overview of Reconstruction. Second half, I'm going to do a deep dive into some research I did for some specific records that I found that really interested me, and hopefully you find them interesting too. That I think adds to kind of the standard narrative of Reconstruction in Tennessee. It kind of changed my view of things too, so let's begin. It's really unfortunate that Lincoln was assassinated when he was. I mean, you all know it's right at the end of the Civil War, and he had selected Andrew Johnson as his running mate for that 1864 election. He was a Southern Democrat. He was an enslaver. He didn't own a plantation out in East Tennessee, but he did enslave people, and he was very much a man of his time. He didn't even pretend to think that freedmen should have equal rights to white people. There's kind of this two famous interactions between him and Frederick Douglass at Lincoln's inauguration, where he gives this famous speech, malice towards none, right? Charity towards all, malice towards none. He says in that, when he was sitting there listening to the speech, or before Lincoln got up to speak, he saw Frederick Douglass in the crowd, and he was sitting next to Andrew Johnson, and he said, "Hey, look at that, there's Frederick Douglass." And Frederick Douglass said he sees this interaction happen, and he sees Andrew Johnson kind of look at him, and he just has nothing but contempt on his face for him. He sees him, and he just has this terrible negative reaction. And then he sees that Frederick Douglass is looking at him and noticed it, and then kind of changed his posture and kind of gave him a friendly hello. But Frederick Douglass said he knew right then what Andrew Johnson's heart looked like, right? And he was not a friend to the black people, right? He was not a friend of the freedmen. And later, when Lincoln was assassinated, a contingent of people, including Frederick Douglass, went to the White House, and they were saying, "Hey, what's Reconstruction going to look like?" And they advocated for equality, said we need citizenship rights, we need voting rights. And Andrew Johnson just didn't want, he was annoyed that he even had to take the meeting with them and treated them very, very rudely. And in fact, Frederick Douglass said he stood up in the middle of Andrew Johnson talking to him and said, "Okay, well, this guy, we're clearly not on the same page, so we'll just go to the people and see what the people think," meaning we're going to go to Congress. This Reconstruction project is not going to happen through the presidency, it's going to happen through Congress. And that's exactly what happened. And it's really unfortunate, too, because, I mean, it made the whole project, the project was going to be contentious to begin with, right? Especially so with somebody like Andrew Johnson in the presidency. And as an archivist with the state, there's a lot of kind of Andrew Johnson apologists out in East Tennessee, because that's where he's from, and I don't blame them for that. But, the whole complexion of the country could have been different if there was more of an ally in the White House during this period after the Civil War, who was more open and more open to ideas about equality between the races. That make sense? Yeah. So no matter what radical Republicanism, I think we all know what that is, but it was the contingent in the Congress, the part of the Republican Party who were strongly unionist and thought that the people who had seceded, the Confederates, people who had fought against the United States and the politicians, should be punished. They weren't really interested in kind of bring the country back together. They were saying these people should be punished for what they did. They seceded. They were treasonous. We're not looking to, collaborate with them moving forward. And many of the bills they tried to pass, Andrew Johnson would veto. And you see, I like this Nash political cartoon here. You can see he's kicking over a Freedmen's Bureau, right? Get it? The Freedmen's Bureau, yeah. With all the figures falling out, kicking out with the veto. And what the radical Republicans had done here was they were trying to expand the power of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was started by Abraham Lincoln in March 1865, just before his assassination. The goal of the Freedmen's Bureau being to help newly freed people just land on their feet. It was a lot of social service. It was, basic needs, shelter, food, at that point, like right after the war, right? Just like very, very basic, just things to live, things to get by. And what the radical Republican Congress wanted to do was expand that. These people need education. Let's help them in many other ways. Let's get transportation going for them. Let's give them legal advice and legal protections. If they're going to sign a contract to work on a farm, we will review it for them and help them ensure that it's not taking advantage of them. Johnson didn't want to hear any of that. And in fact, one of his reasons for that was he said that he didn't feel that it was appropriate to lift up newly freed people when there were white poor people who were not being helped. And that was his argument. His argument against citizenship rights for newly freed people was that, well, white immigrants from Europe have to live here 7 years before they can get their citizenship. How is that fair to newly freed people? And that's, argument is ridiculous. I mean, it's, freedmen were multi-generational Americans at that point, right? So it's just kind of frustrating and think about how frustrating the radical Republicans in Congress must have been. So at that point, they said, okay, we're going to start vetoing his veto. They overrode Johnson's vetoes at this point, and were able to expand those powers of the Freedmen's Bureau. I'm a sucker for a good political cartoon. So some of these legacies of Reconstruction, before we get kind of more granular with Tennessee, a lot of people see Reconstruction as a failure, but it was also this moment where we had these three vitally important constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment, which banned slavery. The 14th Amendment, which is exceptionally important. Citizenship rights. If you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States and entitled to all the rights therein, including due process of law and equal protection, which would come in very, very important later in the 20th century. I mean, that was what Brown versus Board leaned on to say that separate but equal is unconstitutional. They say, well, this is an equal protection issue and violates the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights to all men, regardless of race. Also a very, very big deal. So this is it's a wholesale change of how the United States views itself. I mean, before you have those citizenship rights, people would say, well, I'm a citizen of this state, which is in the United States. At this point, after this point, people are like, well, I'm a citizen of the United States, and I happen to live in Tennessee, right? It was just kind of a wholesale change of how citizens viewed their place in the country and their rights therein. This Freedmen's Bureau, so originally it was called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And just kind of colloquially became known as the Freedmen's Bureau. That just can give you a sense of what their mandate was when they started. I mean, you think of all the refugees that were coming out of that war, not just newly freed people, but just people who had been caught up in the war and lost their families, and all the lands that were abandoned, what to do with those. There was a strong argument to take those lands and give them to formerly enslaved people as a way to help them get on their feet. Now, unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau was, like a lot of government offices, it was understaffed and underfunded. So sometimes that happened where those lands were redistributed, but most of the times they were not. As I said, they originally provided those social services, provisions, and shelter. Eventually expanded to legal advocacy, but education is what I wanted to talk about, really lean into here. I believe this is from Harper's Weekly. This was published in there, known as the free schools, right? So this was a moment where our relationship with education completely changed. Before this, like a public education was really unheard of, right? It was all private or done with tutors, and they recognized this need to educate people who had been denied the right to be educated. And there were many Confederate States where educating enslaved people was illegal. An enslaver could be charged and penalized heavily if they were caught educating the people they were enslaving. That's at the History Center. That was one of these lost cause myths that I had to combat quite a bit. I mean, a lot of people seem to be convinced that, a lot of enslaved people were treated pretty good, and they helped them get education and everything. And it's all myth. It's all part of the lost cause myth to make the goals of the Confederacy seem less awful and unethical, right? Like, it was illegal in most states to educate enslaved people. In Tennessee, it was not illegal, but it was illegal there were strong penalties if an enslaved person was caught with a forged document, a forged transportation pass, for example. A lot of times that was how they escaped slavery and made their way north. You get a hold of one of those travel passes that they needed to have to travel freely. I mean, they couldn't travel freely at all. They had to show this pass all the time. So that's one reason they didn't want them to be educated. It was they didn't want them to learn how to write, to forge those passes, to escape. They also didn't want them to learn how to read so that they wouldn't be kind of swayed by abolitionist literature, right? So educating newly freed people was central to the goal and project of Reconstruction. And the Freedmen's Bureau took that up as one of their main causes. And again, it just completely changed the relationship between the government, the role of government in educating the public. Make sense? Yeah, and we're going to see here in a minute how that plays out in Tennessee. It's very, very interesting. Tennessee Reconstruction is pretty unique compared to other southern states. It was the first state readmitted to the Union early in 1866. So it was admitted as soon as they ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. They were welcomed back into the United States. And the kind of radical Republican-controlled state legislature here was, passed it. It was funny that when they tried to ratify the 14th Amendment, they didn't have a quorum. A lot of the conservatives in the in the House, they fled so that they couldn't have a quorum in order to pass the 14th Amendment. And what Governor Brownlow did, and I'll dive into Brownlow here in a minute too, what he did was he ordered the Davidson County Sheriff to go and arrest any conservative representative who was not present in the State House, and he found a couple, brought them in, they chained them to their desks in the State House to have a quorum, and that's how they passed the 14th Amendment. But Tennessee was able to avoid the true military Reconstruction, so we had these Freedmen's Bureau field offices here. Those were technically under the Department of War, which is what it was called at the time, and evidently it's still called that. But all the other southern states were put into these military districts with generals from the U.S. Army in charge of them. Now, Andrew Johnson was the military governor of Tennessee for 3 years before he was selected to be Abraham Lincoln's running mate as vice president. But because Tennessee was kind of the first, or Nashville was the first state capital to fall, the Union presence here throughout most of the war really aided Tennessee being readmitted back to the Union. When Johnson left for the vice presidency, that's when they said, okay, let's start civil society back in order here. Let's get people voting. Let's get state government up and running again. And because they didn't allow anybody who had supported or served in the Confederacy to vote, it was a wave for radical Republicans in the State House there for that early 1865 government. And so it was pretty easy going when they wanted to, well, they needed the quorum, but once they had it, it was overwhelmingly passed to be readmitted to the Union. Any questions so far? I want to get, yeah.
Can you tell me what military reconstruction means?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So there was a large Army presence, right? It was more than just staffing field offices like it happened in Tennessee. So there field offices all over the state, but again, I said they were kind of poorly manned and underfunded, still under the U.S. Army's jurisdiction, but military reconstruction, these military districts, huge military presence, like tens of thousands of U.S. Army soldiers stationed in those states, whereas in Tennessee it was, I mean, I don't know that it was even more than 1,000 throughout Reconstruction. And that's because Tennessee was readmitted to the Union, and they didn't want a strong military presence back in a state that was now loyal to the United States, right? And so these other states, which hadn't jumped through the hoops that the radical Republican Congress demanded of them, which is ratifying 13th and 14th Amendment, and showing that they had a solid state government ready to pick up social order and have a civil government. Tennessee, as I said, was able to do that quickly for reasons I already said. And that's the main difference, is a huge army presence there. And one of the other reasons they were okay not having that presence in Tennessee was, as far as the Confederate states went, Tennessee had a lot of Unionists in it. You know, you'll get compared to some of these deep South states, they were ardent Confederates. There were very, very few people in those states that were, could say, well, that's a Unionist. And Tennessee was full of them, especially in East Tennessee. Right? I know you guys know that history very well. So many of those people enlisted in the U.S. Army. They were very, very anti-secessionist, especially this guy, William Ganaway Brownlow, known as the Fighting Parson. The radical Republican state legislature chose him to be the first governor of Tennessee after the Civil War, and he made his name as, he was, I believe, a Methodist minister, but he also, was that wrong? Was he not Methodist? Oh, okay. I thought so. But he ran a newspaper, right? He was a newspaper editor then. He was vehemently anti-secession. I mean, he was as far radical Republican as you could get. He was did not want Tennessee to secede. When they did, he was considered public enemy #1 in Tennessee by the secessionists. So I don't know if he was arrested and kicked out of Tennessee. Yeah, maybe you might know. He seemed to know Brownlow pretty well. Or he fled Tennessee. But I found a letter that he wrote from Illinois, and he said, I'm looking around here in Illinois, and there are more secessionists here in Illinois than there are in Tennessee. And it just goes to show how there's so much gray area when we think about the Civil War. It's not as white and black and clean as we like to think it was. But he was a solid choice for the radical Republicans because he was seen as somebody who could really take up that governorship and make things happen for Tennessee, and especially moving forward equality for newly freed people in Tennessee. I want to show you this. This is a famous portrait done by George Drury. Once the Democrats retook the General Assembly in 1870, they positioned Brownlow's portrait in the State House where it would be easy for them to spit their chewing tobacco on it. Yeah. And they did that for years, right? I think this is now at the State Museum. Look, maybe it got put back up at the State House for a little while and brought back down for some reason. Yeah, I don't know. But I think it's important to point out here for Tennessee that this coalition that they'd formed was very tenuous. The radical Republicans, you had radical Unionists, right, who wanted to, punish former Confederates. They said, they were traitors. They should not have the right to vote again. They should never be able to hold office again. Punish them for what they did. And then you had conservative Unionists who were more kind of the kumbaya, saying, no, hey, we've already been through enough. This country needs to come back together. They looked at Lincoln as kind of being more conciliatory. Say, let's give them the same rights as they had before. Let's mend these wounds and bring Tennessee back together. And as time went along, as we'll see, this got a little bit more, got increasingly tenuous and even violent. So the question of the franchise, who was going to get the vote, was very central to understanding Tennessee Reconstruction. I think it's really fascinating because had you asked Brownlow when he first took office, do you intend to, are we going to give equal rights to newly freed people? And he would say, well, no, absolutely not. Like, we've ended slavery. That's enough. Right? He had no intention of passing laws that would help, equalize society in that civil regard. But as time went on, he kind of warmed up to it and was kind of an opportunist that way. Because what he did was, as he saw his policies were more and more unpopular, he ended up installing county commissioners for voting registration that were very pro-Brownlow, let's put it that way, ensuring that not only, I mean, it was state law that if you had served in the Confederate Army, or supported them in any way, you were banned from voting. But he installed kind of these commissioners of registration for voting in every county. And he got a law passed that allowed him to do that and control who it was. And then he told them, over time, like, hey, make sure that whoever you're registering to vote is a Brownlow guy, right? And as time went on, people got very, it just really rubbed people the wrong way. And it's kind of the story in U.S. history too, right? As democracy itself becomes a threat to politicians' power, they resort to increasingly undemocratic means to hold on to it, and that's exactly what happened here. So when he decided, okay, let's enfranchise the black population of Tennessee, it wasn't because he really wanted to. It was because he knew that they would end up voting for him and ensure that he stayed in the governorship. And the black community, they were wise to that. Of course, they wanted to vote, but they then asked him, like, hey, let us serve on juries too. And Brown was like, hey, now wait a minute, don't get crazy, right? He said, let us serve in public office. No way. No, Brown, he drew a line. He didn't stand to gain from helping confer those benefits of civil equality. He only wanted them to vote because he knew that they would vote for him. Yeah, which is unfortunate and was surprising for me to read, but you got to think how this made people around Tennessee feel, especially within the Republican Party. He increasingly lost support, even from radical Republicans, for these draconian methods to stay in power. You got to also think about what this did to former Confederates who were already angry that they were being denied the vote. These were men who were kings of the castle, right? They owned these estates. They owned people as property. They were the ones that were deciding who was in power. They voted, and suddenly they had no say in government, and then saw people that they had previously enslaved standing in line to vote in their place, and it enraged them. And so what began as kind of this goofy social club down in Pulaski morphed and evolved into this awful white terror vigilante group, spreading terror and violence throughout Tennessee, trying to intimidate freemen and their white allies. And they hated Brownlow. I mean, their number one goal was to reinstall Democrats back in power. And you kind of have to kind of push through kind of the stereotypes of the Klan. They're racist and terrible, but when push came to shove, their number one goal was removing Brownlow from power and getting Democrats back into power. And the way they were going to do that was somehow getting the vote, or intimidating people who were going to vote against their interests enough where they would stay away from the polls, right? So Brownlow wasn't going to take this lying down himself, and he was able to get the General Assembly to pass a state guard law, which would enable him to conscript an army and then deploy them wherever he wanted in Tennessee. He could declare martial law, and he did so a handful of times. Whenever he would hear there was Klan violence, he would go and he's like, well, let's bring the state guard out there to get civil order back in. And what the Klan would do is when they would call these troops out, they would go back into hiding, right? And Tennessee had a big budget problem. They were going deep in debt, and it was expensive to call out the state guard and deploy them. And so what these Klansmen did was they'd call out, and instead of fighting them, they'd go into hiding, right? State guard would go away, leave their communities, and then they'd come back and terrorize people again. So it's kind of this back and forth between the two. And it's important to point out with the state guard, this photo was actually taken at Fort Negro. I believe these are U.S. colored troops in the Civil War. I wasn't able to find a photograph of the state guard, but there's a really excellent book by Ben Severance, I believe his name is historian, called The State Guard, that I highly recommend to everybody. But so many of these guys in the state guard were in the U.S. colored troops. These were battle-hardened veterans of the Civil War being deployed and out ready to fight the Klan and keep civil order. And as things got more violent, 1867 into 1868. I mean, people were very concerned in Tennessee about an intrastate civil war happening here. And every time Brownlow deployed those troops, which I don't blame him for doing so, you can't let these vigilante groups just go out and terrorize people for their beliefs. But tensions were very high. Tensions were hot. And just before a vote, it's like February 1869, he called the state guard out again and deployed them into 13 counties across Tennessee. And it's a little wishy-washy why he picked the counties he did, because they didn't all have Klan activity. So it's kind of, historians are kind of, we scratch our heads about some of those. But he calls them out to keep order again, and then 2 days later resigns the governorship because he wants the open U.S. Senate seat. And the General Assembly was more than happy to install him in there for that. And I think, you know, it kind of makes you scratch your head again. Like, why would he do that after, you know, wanting the governorship so bad and all the work he did in it? But I think he kind of had a sense of, you know, what the feeling was in society. I mean, people were, at this point, very anti-Brownlow. The way that he was controlling the ballot box, people were uncomfortable with the state guard having troops deployed in their communities, especially white Tennesseans seeing black troops in their communities. It was upsetting to a lot of them, unfortunately. And so he resigned, and a gentleman named DeWitt Clinton Center, who was the Speaker of the Senate, and as secession went, at least then, I'm not sure if it's still this way today, but as the Speaker of the Senate, when Brownlow resigned, he became governor. And what he did was, he was a far more moderate Republican, right? He wasn't a radical. He wouldn't even call himself a conservative. But as soon as he took power, the Klan, they went into hiding again. They said, Brownlow's gone, our public enemy number one's gone. Let's see how this plays out. And sure enough, Center, kind of responding to what the Nashville community was, or the Tennessee citizens, where their leanings were going. They were so sick of the violence. They were, complaining about it. We're going to look at some petitions in a minute that I found in this era. And basically what he did was he said, we're going to extend the franchise, universal male suffrage. Anybody 21 years or older will be able to vote. So that included freemen, but it also included his former Confederates. Yeah.
Is that a typo, 1969?
Yeah, that's a typo. Sorry about that. Yeah, 1869. Sorry about that.
He was Brownlow was in the Senate to vote for the impeachment of Johnson. That was in 1868, wasn't it?
I don't think Brownlow he wasn't senator by then. No.
He was senator. He voted for impeachment of Johnson.
Brownlow did?
Yeah.
I know there were two Tennessee senators, and they both voted. They voted for acquittal. I'm pretty sure.
Well, one of them was his son.
One's a son-in-law. Yeah.
The other one, I'm sure Brownlow voted for too.
I don't know. Well, yeah, we'll look that up because I'd always read that they had both voted to acquit him. And when Johnson was impeached, he fought off impeachment. He missed it by one vote, right? He had one more vote voted against him, he would have been removed. What Center did was he said, okay, I'm going to install my own county registers of the vote. I'm going to remove these Brownlow guys. And so even though it was illegal, it's still on the books, illegal for former Confederates to vote, he installed these registers who let them register anyway, knowing that was, that's kind of where the winds were blowing in Tennessee, and also he knew he would benefit politically from that too. And in fact, that was challenged in the Tennessee Supreme Court, and they said, well, Center is allowed to put whoever he wants in there because that's what the law said for Brownlow, and he did the exact same thing, so Center's allowed to put whoever he wants in there, right? Yes?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You just say that in 1869, DeWitt Clinton Center extended the right to vote to free former slaves?
No, that's what I said. I misspoke. So former slaves were extended the right to vote in 1867 under Brownlow. What Center did was he installed different county commission registers who controlled the vote, who allowed any male 21 and over to vote, regardless of their political affiliations or their former condition of fighting against the United States, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, what happened was then the Democrats swept into power, of course, at that next election. And by October 1871, a former Confederate general, John C. Brown, was elected, swept into power, and a lot of that work done for Reconstruction and all those Brownlow policies were dismantled. They called a constitutional convention for 1870 and rewrote the Constitution, still the Constitution we operate under today. And it really kind of set the stage for Jim Crow laws later. That make sense? Yeah. So at that point, the Reconstruction project in Tennessee was done, right? It's real unfortunate. And kind of what happened with Tennessee, it happened fast, right? And when you look at other southern states, it's almost like what happened in Tennessee happened there too, but it just took a lot longer. And they could have looked at what happened in Tennessee and said, that could have been a cautionary tale, right? Like, you know, if Tennessee can't get this right, where there's so many unionists, what chance do these southern states have to get Reconstruction right and really help confer equality and, you know, reinstall a fair civil society coming out of the end of slavery? Yeah. I think that's some type of like Masonic regalia, something like that. Yeah. So let's fast forward here. I have about 20 minutes left. Fast forward to 2018. I'm a young budding archivist at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. This is the old building, right? So this is back when I could peruse the archives and just walk up and down aisles and say, "Oh, what's this box?" And look in there and check it out. But yeah, I was assigned to Record Group 60 of the collections there, which is the General Assembly papers, and they were in a state, we call this minimally processed. So basically all these bills, petitions, everything was tri-folded up, very dirty, and just stuffed into these Hollinger boxes, right? And so my job there was to go through these, flatten them, clean them, figure out what they were, and get them in a more fully, properly processed state for their kind of long-term health and access for future researchers. And I was able to, in the course of this work, find some fascinating records I want to share with you guys. But kind of that story of Reconstruction is that's kind of the standard narrative that I just shared with you. And I found some things here that I think add to it and change it a little bit too. So I'm excited to show these to you. One of which was a petition to the governor and the General Assembly that was arranged in a 60-foot scroll. At the time, the Assistant State Archivist Wayne Moore, in the meetings, said, "You seen anything interesting going through those records yet?" And I said, yeah, come check this out. So I knew that this must have been important for it to have been arranged in a scroll. I mean, this is a grand gesture, right, to present it to the General Assembly. And I'm going to focus in here. I've got it pulled up where we can actually see. Where is it at? Here it is. So this is what it says. So basically what these people did was they went around, they fanned out around Middle Tennessee to collect signatures on this petition, encouraging the governor and the General Assembly to re-enfranchise former Confederates. And I said, wow, that's a lot of signatures for something like that. They must have all been former Confederates signing it. And sure enough, there were a lot of those petitions they received too. There's one petition I read about in a newspaper from this time where every living Confederate general had signed the petition encouraging the franchise to be reinstated to former Confederates. And it was, all those went to the General Assembly and they're read into the record and politicians responded to them. These are the days before you can just go on Twitter and tweet your representative to have it ignored. Right? But you could actually sign these petitions and send them directly to your lawmakers. And so they fanned out across Middle Tennessee collecting these signatures. But time and again on these, when you go through these signatures, there's over 4,000 signatures on them. And J.O. Shackelford, he was a Supreme Court justice who Brownlow put in the Supreme Court. So you had U.S. Army veterans signing this. They would sign their name and then U.S. Army and where they served and in what capacity. And there are also hundreds and hundreds of back then they called them colored people. They were black Tennesseans signing these petitions to get the vote back to former Confederates. And I said, well, that's interesting. I have never heard of that in my life. Why is that? So I did a deep dive into newspaper records, just seeing what I could find. And let me show you, because it is pretty fascinating. Let me see here. Well, I'm not sure I have this one pulled up, but I found one gentleman who signed. He was interviewed in the paper, right, local paper, and he said, "I signed this document, and here's why. Yes, I'm a formerly enslaved person, but who would I be as a citizen, having been denied the right to vote my whole life? Who would I be now if I argue that that man should not vote, that man should not have the right to vote?" And it gives you goosebumps to think about that. Because, I mean, how egalitarian, right? I mean, it's so moving. It's like having been denied this right, how do I deny it to somebody else? And that sentiment, it's so beautiful. Some of these other petitions, they said they were getting really sick of living under white terror from the Klan. So they're directly citing, like, society's coming apart at the seams here. There's nothing more American than the right to vote. Let's bring the country back together. Let's bring the state back together. Let's calm tensions. Let's get everybody the right to vote. Well, of course, women would have to wait a long time for that, right? But universal male suffrage, 21 years and older. And so that was news to me. So U.S. Army veterans living here, newly freed people. I found an article where they presented this petition to the General Assembly, and it was Justice Shackelford and a former Mississippi governor, I believe his last name was Foote. They came in and gave these grand speeches with this huge rolled up petition to the General Assembly, beseeching them to re-enfranchise former Confederates. And in the article, it says the gallery there at the State House, it was filled with African Americans supporting the petition. And so, this kind of puts the narrative stands it up on its head a little bit, right? Like I think the lesson there is, center kind of gets a bad rap. I mean, he's looked at, him extending the franchise to Confederates as a way to stay in power, right? But I think what this petition in particular shows is that there was a huge movement across Tennessee to end disenfranchisement for former Confederates. And it's hard to blame them, and yet you see what happened as a result, and it's an important and interesting historical question, isn't it? Whether that was the right move. Something else I found, I'll talk about here the little time I have left. In that meeting with Wayne Moore, one of my fellow archivists, after he looked at this and was like, wow, he's blown away by it, and he looked at my colleague Kim Wires and he said, "Have you found anything interesting?" And she said, "Well, check out this resolution that the House passed condemning the kidnapping and murder of a detective that Brownlow hired to infiltrate the Klan." And I said, all right, I'm going to have to research that too, right? And sure enough, kind of the standard narrative of that incident, all we know about it really, it comes from Stanley Horn, who was the very first Tennessee historian. He wrote the first kind of history book of the Ku Klux Klan, and a little bit of a Klan apologist, I would say, but he writes about this Barmore incident, and the standard narrative of it is that Brownlow had passed this anti-Klan act in 1867, made it stronger in 1868. He wanted to prosecute people in the Klan. He wanted it to be a public spectacle. He said, look, I'm going after these guys. I'm keeping Tennessee safe. And over a year later, he still hadn't been able to prosecute anybody. I mean, they operated in such secrecy. And so he hired this detective named Seymour Barmore from up north, supposedly the greatest detective in the world, to come down and infiltrate the Klan. I'm telling you, this guy was a character. I mean, I think the closest I could come up with is like Ignatius Riley from a Confederacy of Dunces. I mean, he was a bit portly in a time where there weren't very many portly people. He had a huge mustache that he wore to cover a severe hair lip that he had. He wore a green velvet jacket everywhere he went with a gold-handled cane, bright rings, and a large fake diamond lapel, like flower lapel. So interesting character, an interesting guy that when he decides to come down and infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan, right? The more I got into it, the more I had to scratch my head about this. And when you look, the only historian that ever has really written about him in depth was Stanley Horn, and he didn't cite any of his information. You go in there, there's no references, there's no citations. And I realized, well, this is why nobody has written much about this, because there's not a lot of sources out there that are at least low-hanging fruit, right? At TSLA, they had the Stanley Horn papers, and I dove in there and found some correspondence where somebody wrote to Stanley Horn and said, hey, you didn't cite anything in Invisible Empire, your book on the Klan. Where are your citations? Like, where did you get this info? And he said, yeah, mostly from newspaper articles. So that's where I went. And I said, I'm going to figure out a little bit more history here on Seymour Barmore. So a few things I'm going to show you here as we wrap up, because this incident, it was important too, because that day that Brownlow called out the state guard and put those 13, 14 counties under martial law in February 1869, that was the day they discovered Barmore's body in the Duck River. The story was he went to infiltrate the Klan. They found out about it. He was in Pulaski, infiltrated the den there, was on the train coming back to Nashville, supposedly with names in his pocket. And when they pulled into Columbia, the train station, 20 people in red garb, hoods and on their horseback, rode up to the train, held a gun to the conductor, found Barmore, pulled him off the train, and he was never seen alive again. They found his body in the Duck River 2 weeks later. That's when Brownlow called out the state guard again, put all these counties under martial law, and then said, all right, I'm going to the Senate. See you later. Good luck. So I said, let's figure out who was this Barmore guy? What can we learn about him? And I found in Nashville, he went by Captain Barmore. He said he served in the Union Army. And what I found, I couldn't find any records that he had ever served in the Union Army. Everybody called him Captain. What I found was he worked for the Provost Marshal in Cincinnati. He was kind of an independent hire. When people would go AWOL, they would hire him to go out and find them. Right? So he kind of segued that experience to opening a detective agency in Columbus, Ohio. Now this is 1865. I mean, there weren't very many detectives going around for hire. I mean, this was a real nascent industry then. You had the Pinkertons, who had famously prevented Lincoln from being shot back in 1861. But you don't see many of these detectives for hire around. And here we see him in Columbus, Ohio. And what happened was he ran this ad in the paper there every single day for about a year, until this was published in the same paper, May 1866, and it was the former chief of police in Cincinnati who knew Barmore when he was stationed there during the war, and he says, this guy is a cad. Don't trust him. Don't hire him. He said, let's see, where does he call him here? He calls him an ass somewhere in here. Is an ignorant ass who goes round the country rubbing the people and officials by pretending to have information that is beneficial to them. So a couple weeks after this op-ed runs, these advertisements stop. I think he closed up his business, and he ends up fleeing west. The next time we see him, next time I can find him in the records, he's in Indiana, and evidently he's helping the Pinkertons solve the very first train robbery in U.S. history. This gang called the Reno Gang in southern Indiana robbed a train from the Ohio and Mississippi Railway. Unfortunately for them, all that money that they stole, about $20,000 at the time, which is a ton of money, was owned and insured by the Adams Express Company out of New York City. Very important. I think they're still important today. Anyway, so they had that insured by the Pinkertons who went on this case. And it's evident that Barmore was helping the Pinkertons. He's kind of one of their local contacts, helping them find these guys. Here they are, Frank and John Reno. And what happened was these Reno guys, they fled to Canada. And Canada, they had a hold of them. They had them under custody, but they didn't want to bring them back to the United States because they were worried that they were going to be lynched. They were worried they were going to be murdered. They said, we don't trust that, we don't want there to be capital punishment. We don't want, mob action on these guys. You got to assure us that their rights are going to be protected. And actually, Secretary of State William Seward got involved and negotiated their return back to, ironically, Seymour, Indiana, is where they were from. And a week later, a mob of 60 people goes in and pulls these guys out and hang them. And it was an international incident. Canada was angry that this happened. This is kind of an interesting local connection there. While Barmore was in Indiana, for some reason, I've never seen this before as a historian, the Indianapolis Daily Sentinel started running these pieces about the man in velvet. I think they didn't want to name him because they were worried about libel, but he was known for wearing this green velvet coat all the time, so they started referencing this man in velvet. And from what I can tell, he had outstanding debts. He was not paying debts to places he was staying, boarding houses, hotels, frequenting bars, and not paying his tab. And I've never seen, over the course of like three months here, almost every day, this is just scratching the surface of what they were publishing about the man in velvet. I mean, they are roasting Seymour Barmore bad. I thought that was pretty interesting. So I think he gets out of Indiana and comes down to Nashville, late 1867. So I think all that bad press he was getting in Indiana with his, just a bad character. But he's also, you're finding all these, I find all these successes that he has. By all accounts, he's a good detective. I mean, there's all these op-eds written about him, like, hey, he did a great job for me. I had this stolen. He went and found it and for me. He's helping with arrests. But I think maybe it takes a scoundrel to catch a scoundrel, maybe. So here you see Detective Barmore will leave for Montreal this morning. When I first saw that, I didn't know about that Reno connection yet. And then when I saw it, I'm like, oh, he actually was involved, because it was the same time that they were trying to extradite those Reno guys. So it's kind of proof that he was actually involved there. So we only have a couple minutes here. So something else I found was that the Klan actually kidnapped Barmore once before. And these weird secret societies, they would kind of give you a warning before they actually harmed you, right? And you see here, this was published in the paper, deliver a course of lectures on the locked degree of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he thought he was being initiated into the Klan and instead got some type of severe, torturous thing called the padlock degree. And I cannot find anywhere what this padlock degree was. And it also makes it, not knowing kind of makes it even more scintillating, right? But when papers reference it, they say, you'll remember Barmore as the guy who suffered the padlock degree from the Ku Klux Klan, the details of which are too horrid to publish here. I'm like, oh, come on, you have them, just publish them. And so you'll remember the Indianapolis Sentinel, not to miss a beat here. You'll see they came back here in 1868. See Seymour Barmore divorcing his wife. He was initiated into the locked degree of the Ku Klux Klan. He's today divorced by the court of Jackson County from his wife. This is what I mean to show you. The man in velvet was recently divorced from his wife. He did not find wedlock so binding as the locked degree of the Ku Klux Klan. So not missing a beat there, not missing an opportunity to really go after this Barmore guy. We've got to wrap up here at 2, right, Gene? Yeah, it's almost 2 o'clock. So something else I found that was outside of the newspapers was this gentleman who was a Confederate veteran, Spencer Aiken from Bedford County. And I found an interview he did in the early 1900s where these former Confederates and Klansmen, they were getting pretty old by then. And so there was a lot of journalists interviewing them. And it's kind of telling that they were kind of proud of the awful things they did back in their Klan days. But it's telling that they were open to speak about it to a journalist and have it published and praised. And kind of tells you about the state of things in the early 1900s in the U.S. But I found an interview he did. There's no provenance on it. It's at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. And he said that he worked for the train station in Nashville, and his colleague said, hey, you got to come to the St. Cloud Hotel and meet this guy with me. His name's Barmore. He says he's going after the Klan and everything. his colleague had no idea that he was involved in the Klan. He'd been initiated. He was a member, a solid member of the Klan. And so he says he sat down and met with this guy Barmore, who just probably drunk, just spilling the beans, saying, "Hey, I've been hired by Brownlow to go after the Klan. I'm gonna do it even if it kills me." And so he tells other Klansmen about it. They're following Barmore every single day, which is how they kidnapped him and did that fake initiation into the mysterious padlock degree. He kept it up, and later on was murdered. It's hard to say whether he actually had names. I've not been able to determine that one way or the other, but when they took his carpet bag off the train and opened it, there was a Klan disguise there. It was a hood and robe in there. So I think it's a good chance that Brownlow did hire him. Brownlow he asked the General Assembly to fund detectives to go after the Klan, and they wouldn't do it, and it appears he did it anyway. So I thought that was interesting. Yes?
You might have some questions?
Yeah, sorry, man. I could talk about this all day. Yeah. Anyone have any questions? Yes?
When I was about 10 years old, there was a TV program called Profiles in Courage. It was from the Presence book. It was McCaddy was still a hero after his death.
Oh.
And they did an episode on Andrew Johnson, and it was about 1860 when he was campaigning to keep the state in the Union. There was an article about it in the Tennessee Historical Reporter later that, I think they got it pretty much as well as a TV show could.
Mm-hmm.
And it's played by Walter Matthau Johnson. And the interaction between him and Brownell, they hated each other. And in fact, Brownell was ardent Whig, and he called Andrew Jackson Andrew Jackass.
Right.
and he was pro-slavery. He was very much pro-slavery, but he was against secession. In any case, in that one incident, Brownlow alerted Johnson that the governor had called out troops to arrest him. And you see in the show, he goes in and just walks into the office, says thank you, and walks out.
Yeah.
So they were allies at that time.
Right. Well, I know when Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment to re-enter the Union, Johnson was very much against the 14th Amendment, and so when it was ratified in Tennessee, I know Brownlow telegraphed to him and had some choice words from, called him a few names that I can't remember exactly what it was, but he sent him a real kind of poking the bear kind of thing.
I think that term when pigs fly came from Brownlow. He had a long thing. Somebody accused him of wanting to become a Democrat, and he said when pigs fly, it had this long list of other things like that.
Right, and that reminds me, so when Grant becomes president in early 1869, and it's clear that the Democrats have swept into power, the radical Republicans in Tennessee, they go to Grant and they said, hey, you got to help us. Like the rebels are taking control of the state government again. Like all this work we've done is about to go out the window. People's lives are at stake. And there was just this concern about sending federal troops into a state that had re-entered the Union and was loyal to the Union. He was really adverse to that, unfortunately. Yeah. And then Censor was also going to Grant and saying, hey, everything's fine. Like, we're letting them vote again, but they're loyal. There's nothing to worry about here in Tennessee. Yeah. Yes. Hey, Kim, how are you?
At what point did the concept of giving newly freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, when did that occur, and how did that happen and then didn't happen?
That's a great question. I don't know the origin story. That someone in here might know that, but I know originally with the Freedmen's Bureau, that when that second act was passed in 1866 or early 1867, overcoming Johnson's veto, that's when they started saying, well, let's expand the aid, social services we can provide to freemen by taking some of these abandoned lands. Because, that's the real question of vital question of Reconstruction. I was like, how do we rebuild this economy in the South that was entirely reliant on enslaved labor when slavery is now banned? And that's where the Freedmen's Bureau really did a good job early on, was reviewing those contracts that workers were signing with the landowners, because those former enslavers still owned all the land. But when the Freedmen's Bureau was gone, that's when you saw the rise of sharecropping here, which was just, there was, what's the accountant term for it? Like usurious, like just terrible contracts. Like they were on the hook if there was a disaster, if there was a drought, if there were no crops. They were indebted to the landowner just for the material to farm. And if they didn't have a product at the end of the day, they remained in debt to them. So it was just, again, another form of slavery. Right? But the 40 acres and a mule, I don't know exactly who coined that term. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually issued by General William Tecumseh Sherman as
Cool.
a general order for the Savannah, Georgia, South Carolina region. When they got to Savannah, he had 10,000 freedmen who had joined the march across Georgia.
Yeah.
He said, we got to do something. So they had all this abandoned land. So he said, give them 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, awesome.
It was in a
Yeah,
general order by the general, but
Yeah.
it never came through Congress or the president.
right.
Why was the land abandoned?
They left because the army, the Confederate army in Georgia disintegrated. So as they were approaching Savannah, they all left. All these Confederates left, and so all that was left
People
was
left.
land and blacks.
Kind of the confusion of war, right? I mean, people were being killed or disappearing. Who knows where maybe they just fled to California and never came back and just abandoned all their possessions. I mean, that happened. Yeah.
The whole idea was to
Yeah.
take land from the Confederates and give it to the
Right.
blacks, and then they overloaded them.
Right. Right. Well, my summary here, I think, try to underscore how important the Reconstruction is. Common themes that we're hearing about today, right? What's the role of government in education? I think the education department has been completely dismantled today. I mean, this is still an issue today, right? Voting rights, who gets to vote, how they register. Brownlow, he would throw out votes pretty frequently. It's all he would need was a contention that, there was Klan activity there. And he would say, okay, well, and my guy didn't get voted in, so we're throwing those votes out and I'm putting in my guy. He did that a lot. I mean, it's really undemocratic, and it really rubbed even a lot of radical Republicans the wrong way, which is why he lost a lot of that support. News bubbles, like, depending on which paper you read at the time, would determine how you thought or felt about the Klan, right? Like whether they don't exist, some people were like, they don't exist, and the papers were pushing that narrative versus others that were reporting, no, there's serious violence going on here in the dead of night, and people are afraid to leave their homes or go to the free schools or go to the polls to vote. So people lived in news bubbles. Citizenship questions, that's alive and well today, unfortunately, and social safety nets. And the last lesson here, one thing to think about is just archives are so cool. Those were 2 documents that I found in my work at the archives, and my access to them, it wasn't really special. Those are public records. Any of you can go to the Tennessee State Library and Archives and request to see those records and examine them. And it's archives across the state are just filled with fascinating records like this, just waiting for people interested in them to dig in and research them and pull out these stories. So I'll leave you with that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.